Good morning, everyone. It is really nice to see so many of you in person after a long time. Thanks for coming. The High Commissioner obviously needs no introduction, but I'll introduce her anyway. We have here High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet speaking to you as she approaches the end of her 4-year mandate as High Commissioner. She'll be delivering a statement and then, of course, take questions. Liz will be moderating the Q&A. Over to you, High Commissioner.
Thank you. I hope this works well because it's like, okay. No, it's not, yeah, that's it. Well, good morning, and thank you all for joining us today in the room and online as well. As you know, after 4 years as the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, my mandate ends next week on the 31st of August. And the world has changed fundamentally over the course of my mandate. I would say the profound impact of COVID-19 pandemic, the ever-increasing effects of climate change, and the reverberating shocks of the food, fuel, and finance crisis resulting from the war against Ukraine has been 3 major issues. Polarization within and among states has reached extraordinary levels, and multilateralism is under pressure. Important protest movements occurred in every region of the world, demanding an end to structural racism, respect for economic and social rights, and against corruption, governance deficits, and abuse of power, in many instances accompanied by violence, threats, and attacks against protesters and human rights defenders, and in some parts against journalists as well. Some led to real change in the country. In other cases, rather than listening to the voices of the people, governments responded by shrinking the space for debate and dissent. Over the past few months, once the COVID situation allowed me to resume official country visits, I have been to Burkina Faso, Niger, Afghanistan, China, Bosnia, Peru, and Bangladesh. I have been able to see firsthand the impact of climate change, armed conflict, the food, fuel, finance crisis, hateful rhetoric, systematic discrimination, and the human rights challenges around migration, among other issues. The UN Human Rights Office has worked in a myriad of ways to help monitor, engage, and advocate for the protection and promotion of human rights. As I have said before, at the UN, dialogue, engagement, cooperation, monitoring, reporting, and public advocacy must be all part of our DNA. We have worked to try to help bridge the gap between government and civil society, to support national implementation of human rights obligations and advise on reforms to bring laws and policies into compliance with international standards, to expand our presences in countries so we are in a better position to work closely with the people on the ground. We have spoken out in private and public on country-specific and broader issues, and we have seen some progress, I would say. The recognition of the human rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment by the UN General Assembly last month marked the culmination of many years of advocacy by civil society. But I am proud that my office support and strong backing of this movement throughout the course of my mandate. The extreme weather events of the past few months have again driven home powerfully the existential need for urgent action to protect our planet for current and future generations. Meeting this need is the greatest human rights challenge of this era. And all states have an obligation to work together on this and to walk the talk, to fully implement the right to a healthy environment. The response to a triple planetary crisis of pollution, climate change, and biodiversity loss must be centered in human rights, including the rights to participation, access to information, and justice, and by addressing this disproportionate impact of environmental harms on the most marginalized and disadvantaged. There has also been steady progress towards abolition of the death penalty. Some 170 states abolished or introduced a moratorium in law or in practice, or suspended executions for more than 10 years. The Central African Republic, Chad, Kazakhstan, Sierra Leone, and Papua New Guinea are among those who have taken steps to fully abolish the death penalty. Other states, including Liberia and Zambia, are also actively considering abolition. Malaysia announced that it will abolish the country's mandatory death penalty, including for drug-related offenses. As of today, 90 states have ratified the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the key international treaty prohibiting the use of death penalty. Concerns remain, however, about the increased use or resumption of capital punishment in other countries, including Iran, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, and Singapore, and others like China and Vietnam continue to classify data on its use as a state secret, limiting the possibility of scrutiny. I have, from the beginning of my mandate, pushed for greater recognition of the indivisibility and interdependence of economic, social, and cultural rights with civil and political rights. The effect of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine have brought into stark focus this interdependence. States must draw lessons from the pandemic and the current food, fuel, finance crisis by designing long-term measures to build better and stronger universal public health and social protection systems. Social protection coverage must facilitate access to health care, protect people against poverty, and ensure essential economic and social rights, including food, water, housing, health, and education. I also call on states to adopt proactive measures, including food, agriculture, and fuel subsidies, to mitigate the impact of the crisis. All of this needs to be designed with people as part of the solution, through investment in inclusive, safe, and meaningful channels for debate and participation at all levels. Governing is tough, and you know already that I've been president of my country, Chile, and there are always many pressing demands, challenges, and problems to address. But governing is about prioritizing, and human rights must always be a priority. And in many situations, my office has been covering there is a lack of political will to take the necessary steps to tackle a situation head-on. Political will is key, because as I always say, when there is a will, that you can find a way. There is a way. States often invoke their own particular context when faced with allegations of human rights violations and when called upon to take steps to address them. Context is indeed important, but context must never be used to justify human rights violations. In many instances, sustained advocacy on key human rights issues grounded in international human rights laws and standards bear fruit. In Colombia this month, the incoming administration has pledged a shift in its approach on drug policy, from a punitive to a more social and public health approach. By addressing one of the deep-rooted causes of violence in Colombia, this approach could be instrumental to better protect the rights of peasants, indigenous, and Afro-Colombian communities, and of people who use drugs, both in Colombia and globally. My office has been advocating globally for a human rights-based approach on drug policy and is ready to assist. The worldwide mobilization of people for racial justice, notably in 2020, has forced a long-delayed reckoning with racial discrimination and shifted debates towards a focus on systemic racism and the institutions that perpetrate it. I call on all states to seize this moment to achieve a turning point for racial equality and justice. And my office is working on the second report to the UN Human Rights Council on this issue to be presented next month. I have always sought, even on the most challenging issues, to encourage dialogue, to open the door for further exchanges. This means listening as well as speaking, keeping our eyes and ears to the context, identifying entry points and roadblocks, and trying to build trust incrementally, even when it seems unlikely. During my 4 years as High Commissioner, I had the privilege of speaking to so many courageous, spirited, extraordinary human rights defenders. The brave, indomitable women human rights defenders in Afghanistan. The determined mothers of the disappeared in Mexico. The inspirational staff working at a health center in Bunia in the Democratic Republic of Congo, serving victims of sexual violence. The wisdom and strength of the indigenous peoples in Peru, who are on the front lines of the impact of climate change, illegal mining, and logging, and defend their rights in the face of serious risk. And the empathy and generosity of communities hosting internally displaced people in Burkina Faso. I found allies in traditional village leaders in Niger who were working in their own ways to advance human rights in their communities. I met young people from Malaysia, Sweden, Australia, Costa Rica, and elsewhere, whose resourcefulness, creativity, and ambition was palpable. I shared the pain of a father in Venezuela who showed me the sport medals his teenage son had won before he was killed during protests in 2017. And I shared the tears of the mother I met in Srebrenica, who carried hope that 27 years after her son disappeared, she will one day find his remains and lay him to rest next to his father's grave. Last week, I spoke with Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar. One teacher I met told me he had earned distinctions in all his classes at school in Myanmar and had dreamed of being a doctor. Instead, he has spent the past 5 years in a refugee camp, having had to flee his country because he is a Rohingya. He said, "I still cry at night sometimes when I remember my dreams," he told me, adding that my Buddhist friends are now doctors in Myanmar. My own experience as a refugee was much more comfortable, with the means to continue my education and with a good standard of living, but the yearning for one's homeland, the desire of so many of the Rohingyas to return home resonated deeply with me. Sadly, the conditions needed for them to be able to return to their homes in a voluntary, dignified, and sustainable way are not there yet. Today marks 5 years since more than 700,000 Rohingya women, children, and men were forced to flee Myanmar for Bangladesh. And Myanmar's human rights catastrophe continues to worsen, with the military, the Tatmadaw, maintaining military operations in Kaya and Kayin in the southeast, Chin State in the northwest, and Sagaing and Magway regions in the Bamar heartland. The use of air power and artillery against villages and residential areas has intensified. Recent spikes in violence in Rakhine's whole state also seem to indicate that the last fairly stable area of the country may not avoid a resurgence of armed conflict. Rohingya communities have frequently been caught between the Tatmadaw and Arakan army fighters or have been targeted directly in operations. Over 40 million need humanitarian assistance. We continue to document gross human rights violations and serious violations of international humanitarian law on a daily basis, including repression against protesters and attacks against civilians that may amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. And I urge the international community to intensify pressure on the military to stop its campaign of violence against the people of Myanmar, to insist on prompt restoration of civilian rule and accountability for violations committed by security forces. Yesterday marked 6 months since Russia's armed attack. I know that Ravina has already spoken to you on Tuesday about it, but I thought that I needed also to mention some things. 6 unimaginably terrifying months for the people of Ukraine, 6.8 million of whom have had to flee their country. Millions others have been internally displaced. We have documented at least 5,587 civilians killed and 7,890 injured. And as we have already said, of those casualties, nearly 1,000 are children. 6 months on, the fighting continues amid almost unthinkable risks posed to civilians and the environment as hostilities are conducted close to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I call on the Russian president to halt armed attack against Ukraine. The Zaporizhzhia plant needs to be immediately demilitarized. Both parties must respect at all times and in all circumstances international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The international community must insist on accountability for the many serious violations documented, some of which may amount to war crimes. I am alarmed by the resumption of hostilities in northern Ethiopia. Civilians have suffered enough, and this will only exacerbate the suffering of civilians already in desperate need. I implore the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front to work to de-escalate the situation and immediately cease hostilities. I also urge a renewed focus by the international community on protracted, often forgotten, crises, including the situation in Yemen, Syria, the Sahel, and Haiti. And I urge continued support for the UN Human Rights Office, the UN Human Rights Treaty bodies, and the UN Special Procedure Mechanism, all of which work tirelessly in defense of international human rights law and standards. The journey to defend human rights never ends, and vigilance against rollbacks on rights is vital. I honor all of those who in their own ways are working to defend human rights. As a woman and a lifelong feminist, I want to pay particular tribute to women human rights defenders who have been at the forefront of social movements that have benefited all of us. They have often been the ones bringing to the table the unheard voices of the most vulnerable. I will continue to stand with you as I return home to Chile. To end, I would like to thank you, journalists, based here in Geneva and across the globe, for the indispensable work that you do. When we in the UN Human Rights Office raise the alarm, it is crucial that it rings loudly. And this is only possible when the world's media get the stories out there. So I thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner. We will now move to questions. We will take two at a time. As ever, we'd be grateful if you could say your name and your media organisation, although we know that some of you are very familiar faces.
Just a second to get dry.
Oh, right, okay. Well, you okay?
I'm okay, I'm okay.
Okay, fine. Okay, unexpected. Okay, so I see that Laurent put his hand up first over this side, so please go ahead with your question.
Sure, thank you. So Laurent Siro, Swiss News Agency, High Commissioner, thank you for that here.
Well, okay.
Thank you for the press conference. We're less than 1 week away from the end of your mandate, and yesterday some NGOs have reiterated their call for the release of that report on China. So are you clearly saying that you intend to honor the pledge that you made to release that report before the end of the mandate? And more broadly, what could you have done differently? Not necessarily on China, but are there some instances where you have some regrets, and what could you have done differently? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Over this side, I see that there is Nina from AFP.
Thank you, Nina Larson, AFP. Thank you very much for taking my question. I wanted to follow up on Laurent's question about the report on Xinjiang, because your office, you said nearly a year ago that it was almost ready. So we've been waiting. There have been repeated delays. I was wondering if you could say something about why it's been delayed for so long, what kind of pressure you've been facing over this report. And if you are planning on releasing it before the end of your mandate, maybe you could give us some insight into what might be inside of it, because we'd be very interested to know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nina.
Okay. Well, we are working on the report. I had fully intended for it to be released before the end of my mandate, and we're trying. Well, now we have received substantial input from the government that we will need to carefully review, as we do every time with any report, with any countries. As I have said before, the issues are serious. In my meeting with high-level national officials and regional authorities in Xinjiang, I raised concern about human rights violations, including reports of arbitrary detention and ill treatment in institutions, and the report looks in depth onto these and other serious human rights violations concerning the Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim minorities in Xinjiang. During my as you say, why it has been delayed? As you were aware, in early March we reached an agreement with the government of China for the visit to the country. So this is something I wanted to prioritize, as it was important to visit the country, to engage with senior officials on human rights issues, to be able to convey directly those allegations to them. And following my visit to China, the report continued to be reviewed and finalized, because we need to also look at what we have seen in China, if it has to be certain things to be reflected or not in the report. So I would say that that's the situation. We're trying very hard to do what I promised to.
What would you have done differently?
What we have done differently in globally? Well, I mean, I've always, in every situation that I had to deal with, I always had to have to analyze which was the best way to get outcomes, positive outcomes of it. So in sometimes I understood because of the gravity of the situation, because it was urgent, I needed to speak up. In some other situations, I thought it was very important, sort of preventing, if I would use that word, diplomatic ways in terms of privately discussing, not privately in terms of secret, but I mean in meetings to discuss with governments or to send letters to ask for situations of allegations we have received or people who have been detained. But some other times, when we knew, for example, that somebody could be executed in the next hours, I will call directly the government or whoever, or the mission, because sometimes we couldn't speak directly to the capital, to raise our concern and to ask to stop that execution, to halt this execution. Sometimes we succeeded, sometimes not. Unfortunately, they have already been executed when we had information. So if I could say, yes, I would have liked to do more. If we hadn't had the COVID-19 pandemic, I feel that limited so much my capacity to be on the ground, to discuss with our colleagues first, and then with governments, with civil society, to be able to go to many more places. So that was really something that it was not my fault, but I felt like something I would have loved to have more possibility to go and to visit more countries. And that's why, since we were able to resume, we tried to cover different regions of the world. But to be honest, the work on human rights never ends, never ends. And sometimes when you feel that, and it happens, I mean, at the UN we work on our common agenda and trying to find how, and the common agenda isn't the Secretary General, but it's the whole UN's common agenda, where we try to say how we solve the problems in the world, what needs to be done. And when everybody was agreeing on this, comes the war in Ukraine. So it's really sometimes very frustrating to be able to advance much more. And sometimes you feel that the world is not getting better, any better. And you try to think, and something that I always try to do is try to think what can work. And for example, in many of these situations, Myanmar, for example, I look at the human rights situation, but I know that unless there is a political transition, human rights will continue to be violated. So I always try to look at things and said, which could be the incentives for the parties to do the right thing? So I not only, if I would say, counting the human rights violation, but also trying to think broader, to think what can really work, so we can work as a UN and with the international community to convince it to do A, B, or C. Maybe that is not for me to say. There are people who may think that I should do things differently. But you know, one is how it is. Some people love to be in the media every day. Some people work very strongly every day and busy with many things. And I try to be as professional, as serious, and as, if I would say, also as effective as I can. Because I always said I'm not interested in being the historian of human rights. I mean, that's very important, but that's for other people to do that. I want to have outcomes.
Thank you, High Commissioner. I see that FA have raised their hands. So if we could go first to Isabel, please. Thank you, Francois.
Thank you, Isabel Sacco for FA Spanish News Agency. In your last report to the Human Rights Council, you raised a lot of, quite a few progress in Venezuela, is better to say. But since then, your team has lost access to prisons where there are political detainees in Venezuela. And there are other situations that shows like some setbacks. And at the top of it, everybody seems to have forgotten Venezuela because of other crises. So what is the situation you are living there in Venezuela? You concede that the agreement that you signed with the government has been used by the government by the government to wash its face? And what about the need of a political transition still pending in Venezuela? And just in a more personal way, what are your plans and your expectations coming back to, or going back to Chile? What is the way you would like to participate in this historical phase that, or transition period that is going on in your country? Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. I know that some people are also joining us remotely, and I see that Christiana has raised her hand, so maybe we could ask Christiana to pose her question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Bachelet, for being available to us. And I am continuing on China. Could you characterize for us your exchanges with China on this report? And is there any pressure from the Chinese government to change what you have laid down in your draft, I guess? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Isabel, well, I think that since I visited Venezuela in June 2019, there has been some progress in human rights terms, but of course more remains to be done. For instance, to effectively implement the ongoing reforms and to protect civic space. We still see shrinking civic space there. What we have done, because we felt, what we managed is to build cooperation and trust with authorities, civil society, and victims over the past 3 years. And we had nothing before. We were out of Venezuela. And now we will be able to have 16 officers, human rights officers, and people there. And we're working in the idea, hopefully someday, to have an MOU to have a full-fledged office there. What has helped us? It has helped us to be able to work directly on the ground with victims, with family of victims, with lawyers of victims. We have been able to visit prisons. Due to COVID-19 restriction, that access was limited, restricted. But we hope this kind of things will change in the near future. And we have been asking to have access to the audiences in the trials. We have not yet been able to do that. So we have had some progress made because we have been able also to discuss with the government, to make certain, if I would say, recommendations on jails and other issues. There has been certain capacity building on some issues with other countries of the region in terms of how to prepare UPR and other issues, but there's still a lot of things that remains to be done. And that's why I have the intention that before I leave, to have a new conversation with President Maduro, probably next week, because I want to, I don't want that conversations and promises be forgotten. And I want, as I've always done when I speak to him, to give them a long list of points where we feel much more needs to be addressed. On this last thing that you asked about, about the political transition, I think it's very important that conversations with opposition and the government will continue. So there has been different international partners who have been working on this, and also the Norwegian ones have been trying to push into this conversation. I hope that they are resumed, so there can be some agreements that can imply that the next elections will be done in a transparent, fair way, so everybody can be able to feel that the results really represent what the Venezuelan people wants. So we will continue, we feel that the political dialogue is essential and it should be resumed as soon as possible. But as you say, it is not now in the, it's not a spotlight now on the issue by many member states. And also you have seen that some countries have started to buy the oil in Venezuela or to lift the sanctions. Not lift the sanctions, but amidst the sanction to start buying oil. So I guess this is also a product of the war in Ukraine. Which are my plans? I have no plans yet because until the 31st of August, I'm the High Commissioner, and I'm focused on that. But again, I think I will never be able to go back, and this is nothing, it could sound like stereotypical, but I always say I'm not going to go back to be knitting. First of all, because I don't know much how to knit, but it's not my, I'm always being interested in what happens in my country, but also worldwide. And I will be available if needed, not for a post, nothing for 24/7, but to help in any dimension that I could be of help, that my experience could be helpful. How will we participate? I have said it in Peru, so I think I can say it again. I will vote on the 4th of September here in Geneva, and I will approve. I will vote for approval to the new constitution, because I think that will mean to advance on the situation in my country. I should tell you that on the 1st of September, when I'm not going to be anymore the High Commissioner. I know that, but I already said it, so it would be ridiculous that now and I've said it in my country as well, so, and everybody knows that I will do that, so I prefer to answer to you honestly. On the issue of exchanges with China, with these reports and pressure to change, well, we have shared the findings with the Chinese mission, and there are typical internal processes, and where a normal practice is that we share either the report, the findings with the governments for comment. When they review carefully, we receive the comments or facts, we review the comments and take on board any factual comment as appropriate. So we will be doing so. Am I being under pressure? We're always under pressure from various sides, from all sides, if I would say, in all situations. Not only member states, but also civil society, as you remember. But our work is guided by human rights methodology and the facts on the ground, and objective legal analysis. So in this case, I have never been under tremendous, I have been under tremendous pressure to publish or not to publish. But I will not publish or withhold publication due to any such pressure. I can assure you of that.
Okay, thank you. We'll go for another round of questions. I see that Gabriela has her hand up. Gabriela.
Thank you very much. Gracias, Alta Comisionada, por estar aquí. In contrast to Gabriela Stomayor, Mexico.
Yes.
Gracias. In contrast to what Colombia is doing in drug policy, in Mexico, the government's strategy to defeat drug traffickers is a strategy called abrazos no balazos, that is, in English, is hugs, not bullets. Then another president started the war on drugs, and none of these strategies had worked. Now the government wants to militarize public security. The government wants to transfer the National Guard to the Defense Ministry, so it's going to be no more civil National Guard. So what scenario do you see with the empowered cartels, a military presence in a country with 100,000 disappeared, an average of 75 intentional homicides per day, and with 15 journalists murdered this year alone? What is your view? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriela. I think on this side, did I see Jamie put his hand up?
Hi, thank you very much. Jamie Keaton, Associated Press. My question is really about how you're going to ensure continuity with your successor. It looks like you're headed towards the end of your mandate without a successor that we know about? Maybe you could tell us if you know anything about who might replace you. And you say you have no plans. I mean, it's, you want to hold countries to their promises and their conversations that they've had with you. So how are you going to ensure that your successor, particularly with the case of China, which you said, you've established some mechanisms to continue dialogue with China. How are you going to make sure that that's actually respected if we don't even know who your successor is going to be, and will you keep an eye on what's happening even after you've left office?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I recognize Mexico's public security challenges. I believe that it's really necessary to maintain the constitutionally enshrined civilian nature of the National Guard. The use of armed forces in public security tasks should be exceptional. Use at the last resort and of a temporary nature and be supervised by independent civilian bodies. That's my conviction, if I may say. My office reiterates its readiness to continue providing technical assistance to a strengthened civilian institution, as well as to, what we say, improve transparency and accountability. You mentioned rightly so, when I went to Mexico, at that time the numbers of people that had been disappeared were 50,000, and now we know that it's even more than 100,000. So I think that steps that the government has taken to address this issue are positive steps. I will welcome those steps. It also was important that they accepted, first of all, the visit of the Committee of Enforced Disappearances, and I think it will be really important that this recommendation will be implemented. And also the adoption of the tools foreseen in the general law on disappearances are priorities to advance investigations and to search for disappearance people. I particularly recognize the contribution of victims of this. When I went there, one of the difficulties that they had is that they didn't have enough forensic capacity to be able to recognize of all those. I mean, there was 50,000 people who disappeared, but they had like 43,000 remains, if I may say, and there was no capacity at that time to be able to analyze those and come into certain possibility of identifying victims. There has been, I think, an important effort done by the government, but also with the international community to support that capacity. So countries from Europe, Argentina, and others have helped to build that capacity. So I hope there will be the political will, and I know that authorities linked to human rights have been very active on trying to push forward on that. We also know that it looks like there is a recent report issued by the government on the status of the Ayotzinapa case. Well, I don't know, and I know that there's a judge that has said that they are already in the possibility to progress on that. I don't know the details, so I cannot say if it's going in the right direction or not, if I may say. But what we will continue is to provide technical assistance, what we have been doing from the beginning, to advance accountability and rise to truth in this case and now the other cases. We're also very alarmed because of the journalists, the violence on journalists. You mentioned 11, yes. We have 12, I don't know, maybe 12 or, during 2022. And so that's why we did made an assessment a couple of years ago, or 1 year ago, on the protection system. And I think I want to reiterate the need for strengthening accountability and the protection mechanisms of human rights defenders and journalists in line with the result of the diagnosis that we share with the government. Yeah. First of all, I think you wanted to know if I have any particular news, but what I know is that the process is going on, and I couldn't tell an exact date when a name will be announced. I think the UN is really interested, and Secretary General really interested do it as soon as possible. But you know, this thing has to be done very seriously. I mean, the only thing that I know that a lot of people apply. Many, many people. Some people talk over 50, I'm not sure, but something like that. But these are rumors. I don't have that's what I heard. And I know some people have called me and said that they wanted to apply, what I think, or they asked me, oh, we apply because we want to continue the way you're doing things, etc. But because I don't know in the interviews how we will do, I will not give any names just in case. I mean, anybody who comes will have its own approach to how he wants to develop his task, if I may say. But what I have decided, and I have spoken to Secretary General and to the DSG as well, that she's also working on these issues, that I will be available to discuss with my successor on, I mean, there are things that you never know before you come here, huh? The way everything works and so on. So I will try to, on one hand, give my opinion, my impressions, my idea of what works better and what doesn't work, but independently that every person has his own way of doing things. And I will give recommendations and suggestions on how to do. But I will, of course, respect what anybody will decide. The only good thing I will have to say is that the Secretary General has been always very respectful of the independence of this mandate. Every time there's issues, he always tells me, no, you are independent, you do what you think is the best thing to do according to what your office has analyzed and defined. So I'm sure that the next person, I hope in September, I mean, September is next week, maybe not the 1st of September, but because the process is the following. The people applies, then there is a group of people in the office that is the Secretary General who looks at all the curriculum and the, if I would say, the profile and requirements that were asked for people to apply and see who met them or not. And then they make a shorter list. Imagine 15 people. I don't know the exact number, but approximately. And of those, they are interviewed by a panel. And this I had the same situation. I was interviewed by a panel with many other people, and then this panel will give a shorter list to the Secretary General, three or five names, and I hope that will be pretty soon. And from there, the Secretary General has to look at who he feels that he or she are the best people to come into this office. And then, because this has to be approved by the General Assembly, what usually happens is that they discuss or they talk to the relevant members, to all, I mean P5, but also to all the groupings, African, Arab, G77, to all the groupings, because nobody would like to bring a name that is rejected in the General Assembly. I mean, if this is a very difficult task, so you need to have the approval. And usually it's not by voting, it's by acclamation. So it's always good to ensure before that the name that will be put into a General Assembly, it's going to be accepted. That's the usual way, and I think it will be the same now. And then the General Assembly will either, I hope for acclamation, the next person. The only other thing that I know is that there's not a need to be either a woman or a man, because in this post we have had enough women and men. So it doesn't need to be, it's not a gender clarity, what could it be? And secondly, neither a region, a specific region, because if, I mean, not every region, but the majority of the regions have been already represented in this post. So I just wanted to share with you the information that I have. Sorry that I don't have more interesting information.
Thank you, High Commissioner. We're very pushed for time because there is another press conference in this room. So I'm going to take BBC on this side quickly, Reuters here on this side quickly, and then Bianca on this side. Very short, very quick, because we have another press conference.
Madam Bachelet, 2 questions, very short. First of all, appreciate the detail about the appointment of your successor. Are you at all concerned, though, that there's going to be a void at the top of UN human rights right at a point? You know, the world's in a difficult space right now. Second, if we could just quickly return to China. All of us in here, I think, know how challenging it is to get even a visit to China, and that you know, that can be viewed as an achievement for UN human rights. We were a bit surprised, though, at your closing press conference, the language that you used when you talked about vocational training centres and so on. I just wonder whether you regret using that particular terminology at the close of that visit.
I did understand the first question. Can you repeat it?
Will there be a void? Are you worried that there'll be a void at the top, like a vacuum of leadership in between High Commissioners?
Ah, okay, sorry, okay.
Okay, and then Emma on this side from Reuters.
Madam High Commissioner, I know you've met with a lot of human rights defenders and victims during the past 4 years, but some of those from China, Uyghurs in particular, feel personally let down. Some of them that I spoke to said that they don't feel that they've had sufficient access to you personally. I was just wondering how you would respond to them at this time. And secondly, Reuters reported last month that China had lobbied you personally, getting other states on board in a letter that asked you to not publish the report on Xinjiang, basically asking you not to do your job. What is your personal reaction to that? And did you write back to them? Thanks.
And the final question on this side from Bianca.
Bonsoir. Thanks, Liz, Ravina, and High Commissioner. Yeah, Globo, Bianca Rotier from Globo TV. So my question is on Brazil. Could you briefly evaluate the situation of human rights in Brazil, comparing when you started your mandate and right now, especially when, is it better or worse, the situation there? And especially when we talk about the risks to democracy. We have seen President Bolsonaro attacking institutions. This week, for example, during an interview to Globo, he said that he will respect the results of election if it's clean and transparent, but we all know that the election in Brazil is clear and transparent, so it doesn't seem a very clear message. In your last opportunity here with us as High Commissioner, what message would you like to send to President Bolsonaro? Many thanks.
Okay. Well, I don't think it will be a vacuum of leadership because there will be somebody OIC and they will continue working on these issues. And also we will continue doing whatever is needed. We have a very strong communicational group that they are always, and very strong colleagues who are always monitoring the different situations where we need to speak out. So I don't think there will be a vacuum. And I think that there will be, the UN will try to have a successor as soon as possible because of the importance of all of these issues. I would say that I do not endorse the language used, I just cited it. So our report will have more detailed analysis on all of this. On the issue of the NGOs, the truth is that my team has had for many years a very fluid relation with the NGOs and with victims and that have alleged all kinds of situations. And I and my team spoke to a number of them prior to my visit. I had meetings with 2 different groups of people, with NGOs, but also with victims and family of victims directly, to have what they wanted to convey to me that I would know before I visit there. And their voices and advocacy are important. I really believe so. And as I said, we already said it, we mentioned that there has been serious situation on the so-called BETC system, and including concerns, we raised it with the authorities, including concerns about arbitrary detentions and ill treatment, as I mentioned already. Well, you asked, I did receive a letter, yes, with a number of states, and that's why I said that I have been receiving pressures from countries who want to publish and not to publish. You cannot imagine the numbers of letters, meetings, asking for the publication. Huge numbers. More than 1 year ago, every day, every time a meeting is asked, I know that this issue will come. Dinners, whatever. And then I received, of course, a letter or a number of countries, 40 or something, I don't remember the number, asking for the non-publication. But I already said, I mean, this is not the way we react to it. It's not pressures the way we define things. It will be on on what our standard procedures are and our methodologies are. So it's that the way we do things. On the global TV on Brazil, well, I think there's a lot of very difficult situations in human rights situation in Brazil right now. But not only now, I mean, it has been, I would say, I'm really concerned by reports of increased political violence, continued structural racism, and shrinking civic space in Brazil. We are following closely the respect for fundamental rights and freedoms in the lead up to, during, and after the election. And we are also supporting UN country team on analysis and prevention work on key human rights issues, including hate speech. Having said that, I feel that attacks against legislators and candidates, particularly those of African descent, women and LGBTI people, are of concern. The UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association in his recent country visit to Brazil in March this year, expressed his view that political violence poses a serious threat to political participation and to democracy. But I think that President Bolsonaro has intensified his attacks on the judiciary and the electronic voting system, including during a meeting with ambassadors in July, which sparked strong reactions, as you know. And the president, what I think is more concerning is that the president has called his supporters to protest against judicial institutions on 7th of September, the day of the 200 years anniversary of Brazil's independence. And that has made that opposition parties have postponed the demonstration that they had on the 10th of September to prevent clashes. I mean, they're not going to do it on the 7th, they're moving to the 10th to prevent clashes. I have to say, as having been a head of state should respect other powers, should respect the judicial power, should respect the legislative power, should not be voicing attacks against others, because it's essential for a president of the republic to ensure democracy. And democracy is to respect the different powers. And I think it's really not a good decision, because you are in the middle of an election, and particularly because you are in the middle of an election. Because sometimes you cannot agree with decisions of our powers. See? You respect them, and you can say you don't agree with them if it's needed, but you respect them. But you don't do things that can increase violence or hate against democratic institutions that should be respected and strengthening, and not trying to undermine them through, strong political speech. I mean, during elections, there is in any country, and we have seen it in many places, usually violence happens. And when you are either a candidate or a president who is a candidate, you should be very, very careful on trying to ensure the best possible conditions for people can feel safe to go to vote. And in that, and I know, for example, that in July, one policeman, supporter of Bolsonaro, killed a Lula supporter. It's not that there has been thousands of these cases, but these cases shouldn't happen. And when a leader start, if I would say, using a language that can be used in the wrong direction, I think it's very bad, really bad. And I said not only as High Commissioner, but as somebody who feels that the leaders, be it president or parliamentarians, need to ensure that the country is able to progress in a way where dialogue, where respect for the others exists. Because that's what democracy is about. It's about everybody have the possibility to speak, to say, to discuss, to defend their positions, but in a respectful way. That's what I believe.
Thank you, High Commissioner. I'm really sorry we're out of time. We appreciate all the interest, and we're sorry that we weren't able to get to all the questions, both from you here in the room and also those of you who were joining us online. Do feel free to reach out to us, and we will try to answer any of your further questions. So thank you all for attending. Thank you, High Commissioner, for this press conference.
I'm sorry because I'm Latin American. I used to answer very long. I'm not the short kind. I'm sorry. I've always been like that. I'm sorry. That makes the time shorter.
Recording stopped.
If you are the meeting host, please enter your host key followed by #.